Thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's Wednesday webinar, Root Systems, Land Cultivation and Hurricanes, the benefits and limitations of applying ecological metaphors to information dysfunction, with Professor Whitney Phillips and Dr. Ryan M. Milner, hosted by Felix M. Simon of the OII. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. Pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time. These will be answered at the end of the talk, and please keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees, and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Whitney, Ryan, and Felix.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this latest OII webinar. It's really exciting to see how many people have joined us from all around the globe. And with me today are Professor Whitney Phillips and Professor Ryan Milner, who will be talking to us about the benefits and limitations of applying ecological metaphors to what they call information dysfunction. And that's work that comes out of the latest book with MIT Press, You Are Here, a field guide for navigating polarized speech, conspiracy theories, and our polluted media landscape. And Whitney and Ryan will present for about 30 minutes before we go over to an open Q&A for the remainder of the hour. But before we begin, please let me briefly introduce our two speakers. Whitney Phillips is currently an assistant professor of communication and rhetorical studies at Syracuse University in New York. She researches and teaches classes on media literacy, mis and disinformation, political communication, and digital ethics, including journalistic ethics and the ethics of everyday social media use. She's the author of This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, Mapping the Relationship Between Online Trolling and Mainstream Culture, and two further books co-authored with Ryan Milner. Whitney is also the author of an ideas column at Wired and is regularly interviewed by national and global press outlets about her work. Her co-author, Ryan Milner, is currently an associate professor of communication at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He studies how online interaction matters socially, politically, and culturally. He's the author of and co-author of three books, The World Made Meme, The Ambivalent Internet, and You Are Here, the latest two co-authored with Whitney Phillips. Ryan has also contributed commentary to outlets like Time, Slate, the Los Angeles Review of Books, NBC News, and the New York Times. So without further ado, let's begin. Whitney and Ryan, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Everybody, welcome to our talk. Okay. Do we see it all right?
Fabulous.
Okay, all right, cool. This is going to work. All right, perfect. So we are here to talk about our book, You Are Here. And this book is a book about media literacy. Unsurprisingly then, it talks about media literacy a lot, but it's not all of the media literacy talk. So specifically the words media plus literacy that makes the book about media literacy. What makes the book about media literacy, at least what we hope the takeaway is how it situates the reader within the information ecosystem. And it does so by presenting different kinds of stories. And of course, it can be pretty tricky to define what story actually is. Stories are related to narratives, but not all narratives are stories. People write and have written entire books about story versus narrative and what makes this story a good story and this other story a bad story. Socio-narratologist Arthur Frank takes a different approach in this conversation. And rather than trying to lasso what is and is not formally a story based on character or plot or other literary elements, what Franks does is describe stories as having particular capacities. To be stories, they need to have a sufficient number of the following of these capacities. And so as you can see, it can run the gamut from dealing with human troubles, informing people about what is good in the world and what is bad in the world, and to tell the truth.
So in You Are Here, we present various narrative devices that we hope manifest some of these capacities. We present personal stories and historical stories and speculative fictional stories. So whether directly or indirectly, all these stories are grounded in a series of ecological metaphors that really drive the entire book. These metaphors were designed intentionally to help readers think differently about the information crisis that we're in, so that we can all begin acting differently and telling stories differently, which is really important to making things better. And so the first metaphor that we use is the pollution metaphor itself, which we use to describe false, harmful, and manipulative information. A polluted information frame allows us to highlight the broader environmental consequences of networked information problems. So in nature, and here's a story that we include in the book's introduction, if you take a bucket of toxins and you dump it at a lakeshore, it doesn't just stay confined to that one spot. It ends up in the water, it then leaches into the soil, it passes on through the geese, and so on, all the way up to us and our communities. It's the same with polluted information online. Something that might start in one spot with one community on one platform doesn't stay there. It doesn't stay private. It doesn't stay in the group chat. It travels. It does stuff, often really, really unpredictable stuff with every turn of the network. So framing information in terms of pollution directs our attention to downstream consequences of polluted information. Saying that something's polluted also allows us to sidestep questions of intent and motivation, and instead focus on the impact that pollution can have and how that pollution was allowed or even encouraged to travel across networks. So within that story frame, polluted information story frame, it's not that intent is irrelevant. It's definitely interesting. Intent determines whether something is, technically speaking, misinformation versus disinformation. That is, whether it's falsity that's spread as an honest mistake, misinformation, or falsity that's spread as an intentional deception, disinformation. But what matters more than that intent is the outcome of the sharing. What happens as a result to what bodies, to what people? The question of bodies is really, really critical here. The polluted information frame zeroes in on the environmental justice elements of this conversation. As is the case offline, marginalized communities online are all the more likely to be inundated by toxicity, and a pollution frame forces us to confront that unequal distribution of harm. All the structural issues that don't just tolerate, but often actively incentivize attacks against marginalized and underrepresented people. The polluted information frame also allows us to more thoughtfully consider how we all, even good faith actors, might pollute, even if we may not mean to, even if in our response to things online, we're trying to help, we're trying to make the world better, or to smoke out the bad actors by shining a light on them, or to counter false speech with the truth. Here too, you can think about these consequences in the context of environmental pollution. We have much more limited conversations if the only pollution we consider is the willful or the deliberate kinds of pollution. And the only people we consider are the willful and the deliberate polluters. There's lots to say about the willful polluters, of course, lots has been said, but they're not the only ones flushing a bunch of shit down the drain. And that includes all the shit that we personally are flushing down the drain, even when, maybe even especially when, we don't consider our actions as pollution. So this polluted information metaphor and all the stories that it generates, it suffuses the entire book, drives the narrative. It's therefore central to the book's other main metaphors that come up chapter after chapter, all of them ecological metaphors: root systems, land cultivation, and hurricanes, three guiding metaphors that guide three chapters in the book. So first, Redwood root systems highlight how polluted information introduced on one side of a grove swiftly filters out, feeding into surrounding groves and the groves beyond that and the groves beyond that. This metaphor emphasizes that we have to be extremely careful about what we're adding to our networks because it'll travel in really, really unpredictable ways. The primary focus of this metaphor and the chapter surrounding it is on the network structures and affordances that animate online life. The process by which information travels, the actual internet tubes, and what they encourage to spread. Next, we talk about land cultivation, which highlights how individual social media users influence their networks simply by existing in them. It emphasizes that anyone and everyone can lose polluted information into whole other environments, regardless again of intent, regardless of whether someone has any inkling that something might be polluted. The primary focus here of this metaphor is on the people spreading the information, on the everyday choices that social media end users and social media influencers and journalists and commentators alike all make, all of which have environmental consequences, no matter the size of your audience. Next, we talk about hurricanes, which highlight the fact that no story or controversy online is entirely self-contained. Like actual hurricanes in actual nature, online hurricanes are fed by a wide range of energies and variables. Actual hurricanes are fed from water temperature and wind currents and coastal development to whether it's high or low tide when the storm passes by. Likewise, online issues are driven by many points of overlap. Overlap between corporate media and grassroots media, between news organizations and their audiences, between this online community and all these other online communities, between the people and the technologies that they use. Taken together, all of these metaphors build on the takeaways of the polluted information frame. So they highlight widespread consequences, and they broaden discussions, and they foreground environmental justice, and they do a couple other things as well. Importantly, they underscore the systemic nature of the problems that we faced. Just like the climate crisis, we're currently faced with a network crisis. And I don't think it's overstatement to say that the survival of our world, or at least our modern self-governance and democracy, as we know it, depends on our ability to fundamentally change our relationship to the environment. And most important of all, we think, to our readers. All these metaphors together help our readers identify where they fit on the network map. That's why we called the book You Are Here. It's about an act of positioning, of telling the story of yourself, situated alongside the stories of everyone else in all the networks that we all share.
So this act and this telling is what makes the book ultimately about media literacy start to finish, even when we're not specifically saying that phrase. This act of placing yourself on the network map, sort of pointing where your You Are Here sticker is, that also helps sidestep some of the dangers of using metaphor and using story to make arguments. And these dangers are not specific to You Are Here, but we still had to think about how to navigate them as we wrote. And one of the metaphor specific concerns is that over time, metaphors lock meaning down. And this worry goes all the way back to the 40s with philosopher Stephen Pepper, who noted that once a metaphor has done its job of sense making, the metaphoric quality tends to become lost or submerged. The as if of the quality is forgotten, and people begin to then speak of that thing in literal terms. So in other words, the metaphor becomes reified. And examples of this, of the sort of lockdown process, include combat metaphors to describe debate. So we attack opponents, we defend positions, and other expressions of often explicitly male-gendered violence to describe discourse. And in reifying that metaphor, in some ways we make it true. Debate becomes combat because the metaphorical index is directing people to approach debate combatively. And another concern about metaphors and the stories that they scaffold is that they're only successful if the teller and the listener are culturally or ideologically aligned. So using the parlance of You Are Here, this is a function of what we describe as people's deep mimetic frames. So these are sense-making apparatuses that determine what people sees or what they know or what they think they know, and what people feel compelled to do in response. And when there's a misalignment between the deep mimetic frames of listeners and hearers, metaphors and their stories can either do nothing or they can outright backfire. An example here would be differing attitudes about the harms of male-gendered combat metaphors. So someone who doesn't share the similar cultural frame might be baffled by all the war talk and not understand what it is that is being communicated. Or they might have a very different affective reaction to that kind of talk. So for people who think that combat and war are inherently positive, or more broadly think that male gendered communication is awesome gendered communication, or that communication can't be gendered, or you are a social justice warrior snowflake lib for even suggesting such a thing, critiquing the metaphor on the grounds that it reifies male gendered violence isn't likely to go very far. And another concern with stories and metaphors, it sort of builds off of this, is that they can trap audiences into limiting views of the world. And Arthur Frank mentioned earlier, he describes these kinds of stories as being greedy. that they foreclose any alternative outside of themselves. And in the process, they can exclude or oversimplify or obscure, things that that otherwise might be explored or acknowledged using a different story or metaphor. And so that's sort of similar to the concern that a metaphor will become reified over time. Stories can also reify, they sort of trap you into thinking about things in a certain way or only seeing things in a certain way at the exclusion of seeing and thinking in other ways. So one of the most sort of striking and problematic areas where this can happen is stories that frame who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And that can be an absolutely deadly paradigm for those who end up marginalized and dehumanized through those stories.
So those are the broad critiques of story and metaphor applied to You Are Here, a book driven really intentionally by really intentional stories and metaphors. They're critiques that pose a challenge and critiques that we had to think through, a few challenges, really. So first, centering our stories on environmental metaphors risks reifying the idea that technologies are natural and that they're necessary, and that in turn could send a deeply problematic, deeply deterministic message that all the harmful effects of the online environment, all of its structures, all the things made by humans, in fact, are just how the internet is, nothing we can do about it, it's nature. A fatalistic view for sure, and one that we tried to avoid in You Are Here's pages, even as we employed these metaphors. A second critique of You Are Here's metaphors might be that in telling these particular stories, using these particular metaphors in these particular ways, we're being greedy, narratively speaking. We're restricting our focus to just certain things when there's always other things we could be talking about, other metaphors we could be employing, other stories we could be telling. So basically by using these metaphors, we're not using these other metaphors. A third related critique of You Are Here's story metaphors, which one of Whit's students actually raised to her really smartly in class, which Whit then brought up to me, and which then we had to ponder about wide-eyed for a bit, is that the book's argument is likely really only going to resonate with people who think pollution is a problem already. People who agree that the climate is in crisis, that climate change is real, people that can see the connection between our climate and our networks and believe as a result that something needs to be done about all of this. If those things aren't true to someone, then what You Are Here's metaphors might do is exclude them from the discussion. This loops back to concerns about the exclusionary risks of stories more broadly that we just talked about. If we'd chosen different metaphors, then maybe the eco-skeptical reader could engage. So to take that last point, yes, it's tricky. Selecting metaphors that would resonate with climate change deniers, who are a numerical minority, might be nice for the climate change deniers, who arguably might need that object lesson more than anyone else. But doing that would risk alienating the majority of those who accept climate science, who think pollution is bad, who intuit the connection we're making between the network crisis and the climate crisis. That's by far the most populous group, the group who believes in climate science, and is the group most likely to be willing to make meaningful change in their own lives. So who do you aim for? The minority or the majority? We aimed for that majority, and You Are Here. It's not that concerns over exclusion isn't warranted or isn't worth thinking about. The problem is you can't thread all audiences with the same needle, and arguably you shouldn't even try. When doing so, sets you up to tell smaller stories, less true stories. Bigger and truer stories are what we wanted from You Are Here. We wanted to convey the impact and significance of the moments. And what gets us there isn't what we bring to the book, because the stories and metaphors we're using, they set our arguments up, but it's the reader's own experiences, their own stories that open the argument we're making to a world beyond the book itself. What the metaphors and stories in You Are Here do, in other words, we hope, is help people tell more stories, help people tell their own stories. Your story, the reader's story, the animation is lovely every time, where you fit, how you have been engulfed in pollution, navigated the forest, cultivated your lands, and weathered your own storms. So whether or not readers externally vocalize these stories or share these stories, the you in You Are Here, that spinning arrow you right there, encourages readers to situate themselves within the arguments in the book's pages.
So One rhetorical benefit of this approach. So that is, sort of an overview of what some of the risks are and why we ultimately made this choice. But part of that is because there are benefits to approaching this, sort of acknowledging that there might be problems. But there are a few rhetorical benefits that we decided ultimately outweighed whatever concerns might be there. And one of them is that active participation in the storytelling process helps increase a story's persuasive impact. And this is something that narrative persuasion scholars like Melanie Green, whose work is amazing, you all should read, have shown in a bunch of different studies. In addition to that, active participation in storytelling also helps mitigate the dangers of reification. The metaphors that we're using in this case, they're not directing attention to themselves as such, not really. We're using them instead and hope others use them as a heuristic. So a teaching tool, a mode of reflection, an invitation for readers to consider connections between institutions, technologies, and communities, and how they fit within those overlapping, always unfolding networks. And as the network conditions of a person's life changes, so too will their stories. So even if the metaphors themselves were to become reified, locked down, the analysis of what those metaphors would guide us to would not, because the landscape is always changing. And the fact further that these metaphors and their stories are foregrounding things like trash and trees and storms and farms, that it further unlocks them to readers. So as other narrative persuasion scholars have explained, when stories index things, when they point you to certain things that people have personal experiences with, like a tree or a storm or a farm, which the vast majority of people have experiences with on a daily basis, maybe not farms, but certainly trees, or maybe some form of growth coming forth from the earth, right? That these are things that are common in people's experiences. And because they're common, they index to a lot of different things, to a lot of different experiences, and therefore are, when they're utilized in this heuristic sense, they're more likely to inform learning in other novel situations. Basically, the lessons get filed away to a bunch of different places in your memory and in your sort of experiential repository, and then are recalled by a bunch of different triggers. And so, it isn't just that. We're also relying pretty heavily on you in the book's title. So our use of you in the title has another rhetorical purpose in addition to the ones that we just talked through. And this is what narrative persuasion scholars like Jeffrey Strange, among others, describe as subjective recentering. And unlike the first person pronoun I, which looks inward, I, me, the ego, you is looking outward. You is how we refer to other people. And when this perspective is applied to the self, something interesting happens. It can help establish critical distance between ourselves and our actions and beliefs and experiences. And you, in addition to sort of creating some space, it can also at the same time gesture towards a generic you, which is used, at least in US American English, to describe people generally. So you refer to groups of people just as you. And what that does is allows people to sort of look beyond the self when talking about the self, which again can help people process difficult experiences and emotions, because you're using this sort of generic word that kind of gestures towards the existence of other people, even as you might be talking about yourself. And many of us, certainly I, do this intuitively all the time. And this is very common, again, in US American English. When we're talking about something challenging, we will often, in our own rhetorical sort of approach to the issue, seamlessly shift between first person and second person, between you and I. So if I were talking about, and a little background here, I'm currently dealing with some very difficult health stuff in my family. My dad is dealing with cancer, terminal cancer. And if I were to talk about those experiences, dealing with this, sort of navigating the stressors of that, it's very likely that I would weave in statements between sort of saying, I am having this experience, I am worried, I am scared, to then shift into talking about you find yourself reflecting on your own mortality, when I am in fact reflecting about my own mortality. I'm telling the story from the first person, but by framing self as other, I sort of invite other as self into the discussion, and also am gesturing towards all the other people who go through something similar. And as a more mundane example, look at the script notes from what we covered just a moment ago. In the notes, we were just referring to, how we decided to sort of guide our metaphors towards climate change believers as opposed to climate change deniers. And in the script, after we wrote it, we realized we had done the exact thing we were talking about. We suddenly shifted from first person to second person. Who do you aim for? We asked, the majority or the minority, and then returned back to the first person. We aimed for the majority and you are here. So how do we tie all these points together? All these reasons why ultimately we believed that these metaphors and stories made the most sense in telling the story that we wanted to tell in this book. So Arthur Frank, again, our friend from earlier, he argues that the relative goodness or badness of a story hinges on its capacity to tell more stories. The benefits of bad stories, of greedy stories that lock down meaning, they're often outweighed by the costs. But the opposite is true of generous stories. They still carry risks, but the benefits are ultimately worth it. And we chose the stories and metaphors presented in You Are Here to maximize this generosity, to invite readers to contribute their own stories, and to consider all the other stories that emerge from all the other points on the network map.
But of course, You Are Here is an academic book, even if it's one that MIT Press hopes will sell pretty well. And as an academic book, its stories and metaphors are rhetorical techniques that we use to communicate with and to hail particular kinds of readers, the people in this audience right now. But those weren't the only readers we were interested in reaching with the message we wanted to send. And theirs aren't the only stories we want the book to help tell. We also wanted to, with these messages, tell a story that was a story as such, a proper story. And so we leaned on our various experiences, Witt's MFA and my 3 kids, and we wrote a children's book, or writing a children's book. You Are Here, a network adventure.
Which, by the way, is currently under review, and we hope that it works out, of course. But if it does not, we are going to be looking for a publisher. So if you know anybody, just keep us in mind. Thanks.
In the story of You Are Here, a network adventure, the protagonists find themselves transported into a network environment, totally overrun with algorithms zipping to and fro, algorithms that have no awareness of anything other than the tasks that they've been assigned to do. The protagonist needs to get home, but doesn't know even where to start. It's then that they encounter a rogue algorithm, one with some sentience, named Them, spelled THM, either pronounced THM or Them, pronunciation pending. Them agrees to guide the protagonist up and over the recommendation castles in the sky, and then through 3 terrestrial lands. First, this should be familiar, the network forest, where all the information passes through.
And so I just want to set the scene. Everyone, please close your eyes. I'm going to read a small little section from this. So, careful not to fall headfirst into the data you and them, or THM, we haven't decided yet, climb down. Once you're standing on the riverbank, you can see where all the green light is coming from. It's streaked throughout the data flows, coming down the falls, forming sludgy little clumps of 1s and 0s. When the green light touches the roots, the whole tree lights up, zapping the next tree and the next and the next. What's that, you ask? Polluted information, Them says.
And then onto the farmlands where data is generated and harvested.
So again, I will read a little bit. So here you are looking at the farmlands. And the soil doesn't look very healthy, but leafy heads of something are growing. The field is circled with train tracks and has large metal bins scattered around its perimeter. Algorithms are stationed at all the bins. At the center of the field, there's a large black box. This is where the mechanical arms are rotating around. What's growing, you ask? Network nodes, them says. Oh wait, I didn't do that correctly. Back up. Network nodes, them says in an official robot voice. Also known as people, a people patch, a patch of people's data.
And finally, to the outskirts, where the hurricanes roar and form and head toward the recommendation castles.
So again, set the scene. There's another data processing center at the base of the mountain. Some data flow into the aqueduct. The rest is being processed and sorted into train cars by the algorithms, which, as always, are scurrying about in if-then frenzy. The train veers to the right. Just ahead, there's a tunnel through the mountain. Hope you like enclosed spaces, them shouts, as you're plunged into darkness. So as these descriptions indicate, we were particularly interested in this children's book in subjective recentering. The entire story is written from a second person point of view. The protagonist is only ever referred to as you. We didn't want to lock down the nationality, the gender identity, the anything of the character. We wanted anybody who read it to feel like they inhabited this role of the protagonist. We also indicated in our illustration notes to the book's illustrator, once we get to that phase, that the book's images should all be from a first person point of view. Everything about the story is centering the reader so that they quite literally can inhabit the story that's being told. And in describing each of the lands and what impact roots and farms and storms have on creating and sustaining the reader's own network environment, we also wanted to hail the generic you, the you in the sense of all people, to gesture towards all of the people around the globe that this you could refer to, each of whom are located within their own networks, subject to all the same forces. And just as in the adult book, the goal of our approach in the children's book was to guide readers away from self-focused individualism, which is a sustained point of critique throughout the book, and towards a more communitarian ethic, one that foregrounds reciprocity and interdependence and shared responsibility within groups, and one that also foregrounds positive freedoms, the idea of freedoms being collectively enjoyed by all members of the particular group. And what the children's book does through its storytelling and what the adult book does through its storytelling is to emphasize in every possible way this critical fact, which is every I is a you to someone else. And when you take on the role of that you, your perspective shifts. You become one self among many other selves who impacts and is impacted by so many other people. And navigating through and out of that, of the mess that we're in, is going to require precisely this sort of thinking. And our hope is that the books and their stories ultimately play a small part in that. Thank you. Stop share.
Thank you so much, Whitney and Ryan, for this fantastic talk. I will restrict myself to just 2 or 3 quick questions so that the audience also gets as much time as possible to ask theirs. But let me start with one about the sort of genesis of the talk and, in fact, the entire book. Could you briefly describe for all of us how you came up with the idea of using ecological metaphors for informational issues and the sort of information dysfunction that you described? Sort of what sparked this and the book project?
I'm going to just jump right in here and say partially a conversation I had with you, actually, all those years ago in 2017, I think it was.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's right. I was just starting to, I think I may have just started working on the oxygen report, although maybe not, but I was just beginning to think about Redwood root systems, which is one of the pictures on my wall. That's where I had gone to college. It's up in Northern California, sorry. And that's where the redwoods are. And I had utilized a lot of that sort of imagery just in how I thought about the world. And it was with you that I first articulated that I was starting to think about journalism in the context of these root systems that were so densely interconnected that, you know, someone over in the Times could report on something and it would trickle out into other parts of the news ecosystem. And then from there, and maybe Ryan will remember this or have a different framework for this, but that was where it started. And then it just emerged organically from there. I mean, where do you place this, Ryan?
So that's definitely part of it. I think another part of it was, and I think this is a significant and intensely kind of personal geographic thing for me. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, right in the Southeast on the Atlantic coast, and I deal with a lot of hurricanes. And we had, before this book, written a book chapter for another book talking about Donald Trump's Twitter account, where we use, hurricane Twitter fingers, where we use the hurricane metaphor to talk about we called the chapter the vernacular vortex. And I remember being evacuated to my aunt's house in Atlanta, Georgia, working on that piece with Whit and realizing the hurricane metaphor really worked. So we had some of Whit's connections to Redwood root systems. We had my connections to hurricanes, and just increasingly these ecological metaphors started seeming to make sense for the kind of stuff that we were trying to figure out as scholars and as authors. And it came together and accelerated, and then we got intentional about that process and what you could really do if you intentionally use these metaphors.
Yeah, and I think that there was a bookend process too, that like I was thinking about root systems under the ground and Ryan was thinking about hurricanes, and we were like, but what's in between? And so then we had to figure out like what would be a kind of mediating kind of space between those. And then we were, after some thinking, it was like, oh, okay, well, land cultivation, farms. So the ways that the metaphors interacted with each other was itself an organic process that was born out of our own experiences with our environment. And then we mapped it slowly over time onto these conversations that otherwise wouldn't necessarily seem like it was an environmental discussion. But the more we developed the metaphors, the more it really seemed to fit.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, everything's connected as we just learned.
Yeah.
I think I was actually, being mindful of the time, jumped straight through some of the audience questions. And the first one comes from Professor Gina Napier at the OII, who says, bravo you two, bravo, this place to end up, every I can be a you, can really help us think about rebuilding our information systems. What recommendations do we have for how we tell news stories about our media ecosystems? How can your work help journalists?
Oh, well, okay. So the journalist question I will get back to in 1 second. Right now, what Ryan and I are doing is, so we kind of got to this place and You Are Here where we sort of identified what the landscape was like. But there's sort of an open-ended point at the end. It's like, we're going to have to think structurally about what comes next. And so what comes next for me and Ryan in terms of the work that we're looking at, it's how you tell these stories. And right now we're focusing on K through 12 contexts. How do you take some of these metaphors and turn them into a teaching heuristic to get students talking about how they fit within the world? And especially when you're dealing with false information or controversial information, conspiracy theories, how do you sort of get people to tell stories about how they fit within the environment and then listen to stories of all the other people who have different experiences to open up their narrative apertures? So we're thinking most intently about K through 12. Just really quickly with journalism, I think that trying to determine what people's deep mimetic frames are, what kinds of stories would help them see the world and see their position in the world a little differently. That's something that newsrooms could think more about. Who are we trying to reach and what stories are they already telling, and how could we intervene in that storytelling process? How can we equip them to then tell different stories themselves to the people in their lives? And so that's sort of the journalism piece, of course, is always related, but we're looking at K through 12, trying to intervene early so that people better appreciate their environments, both online and off.
So I can jump in with the journalism dimension of this as well. One recommendation that we make in You Are Here in terms of storytelling is where you point your metaphorical camera, or if you're a journalist, sometimes your literal camera. So how you frame a story can be really impactful. And so if you're focusing on just the apex predators, just the heavy polluters, then you're telling specific kinds of stories. You can turn your camera around and not just focus on the problematic actors and the big bads out there, but focus on all the people who are impacted by pollution. You can tell stories of people on the other side of the coin. And by flipping that around, you tell stories that are less about a lone actor doing a lone bad thing and more about our interconnections, and especially our interconnections that really impact the people who are hit hardest by pollution.
Yeah, and also the fact that even when our intentions are good, we all individually can contribute to polluted outcomes. That when you're just focusing on the sort of big bad apex predators, you're not looking at the ecological conditions that nourish them. So in the case of, thinking about deplatforming certain high-profile individuals in the United States at this moment, getting certain former presidents off of Twitter, I understand the argument for that, but we need to look at what ecological conditions nourished that former president. What was happening in other parts of the ecosystem, and how were people contributing to that, maybe without even realizing it? And so it's about getting sort of, again, opening up the narrative aperture. So we're not just looking at the expected place, we're also looking at the interconnection of all of the places, particularly how we fit within them.
Cool, thank you so much. Another question, this time from Chica Camargo, who says, thanks for the talk. Now, some metaphors or frames might sound like a good idea, but for policy purposes, they might backfire. For example, talking about an information ecosystem could possibly lead to people thinking that it isn't really their problem, like people throwing their trash on the street. What do we do then? Should society promote stories that allow us to tell more stories, or should we promote stories that lock meaning and focus on solving problems?
That's such a good question. It's tricky. I mean, it's the thing about stories and metaphor is that there's always a sort of a counter case that could show how a story or metaphor could be really problematic. What's interesting within the policy sphere, so narrative persuasion is an area where we've been looking at quite a lot, having written this book and then having written the children's book and then thinking, okay, how do we apply this to classroom circumstances? That's required us to do broad reading in a lot of different fields, in law, in health sciences, in learning sciences, and also within policy. And that one of the things that has been pretty apparent for the last several decades is that narrative stories are how you get people to do things in policy capacities. If you're not telling a story, you are not going to get people to budge. That throwing facts at them, throwing data at them, that's not the thing that's compelling. It's the narrative that is. And so the trick then becomes, to the point of the question, how do you tell the right one? How do you tell a narrative that is going to facilitate the most pro-social, pro-democratic, whatever outcomes that you're looking for? And Melanie Green, who I mentioned earlier, she's doing a lot of great research right now about how you tell pro-social stories, how you tell stories so that people feel compelled to do the right thing in a communitarian capacity. And so, that is an area where we're going to be thinking too, but it's sort of, the question is, how do we do it? That's the tricky thing. And that's what we're still kind of thinking through. Because if it were easy to do it, we would have told the stories correctly already. So it's exciting, but also sort of nerve-wracking, because it is that question of, well, this is great, how? And we're working on it, is the sort of the shortest answer. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I definitely think that with this decision to go with the pollution metaphor, we struggled with the fact that what we didn't want it to turn into was a book entirely about personal responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. And this kind of hopelessness that well, it's a massive problem, these structural problems, and what's my one little thing going to do to fix things? So we wanted to simultaneously acknowledge the big structural problems, but also give people some agency to make some decisions in their life to make their information ecosystem a little better. And so we wanted to speak to people who might think that them throwing their trash on the street isn't that big of a deal, while also acknowledging that one person picking up their trash isn't what it's going to take to fix this problem.
One other really interesting question that has come up in the chat at the moment is basically it relates to the way you sort of talk to wider audiences, because usually in academia, well, we publish the book, we publish the article and probably the op-ed, but actually what you've done is quite rare, that you sort of go extra mile and do the children's books. And Amy Hine asks, could this project also be extended to even other media forms? So go even beyond the children's book? And if so, what would that look like?
So, I mean, absolutely. We're all about the extra mile. I saw a couple of people in the comments talking about video games, which I think are a great example of a way that you can tell kind of second person hailing, subjective recentering kinds of stories. I think that's one of the strengths of the video game format, is that they're a story that you live out, that you play. And so obviously neither of us are game designers or developers or coders. If you are, drop us a line. If you want to make a You're Here video game where you clean up network pollution with them or something, that'd be great. But yeah, I think that we're committed to this as scholars and as intellectuals. We think that we are producing stuff that will help people, and we want to get it out to the public in a lot of different formats. And so the children's book was a step in that, and it was Wit's inspired first step. But I think that we can do a whole lot and think about a whole lot of other platforms where we can tell stories, specifically us, but then all of us academics and scholars can be reaching out to sharing the truth, sharing our stories, sharing things that we think need to be said in other contexts to wider audiences.
Yeah, I mean, and we, even in the framing and the intro of the book, we make very clear that, you know, we welcome every conceivable audience. I mean, the one place where we draw a line is that, you know, citizens of bad faith who don't actually care about the world that they share with others, or they're not concerned about how their actions might impact others. I don't know how you would reach those folks, because that's a very different paradigm. That's a whole different set of deep mimetic frames. We don't think that the book is going to change their minds overnight. And, you know, citizens of bad faith also are in many cases actively working against communitarian outcomes. So we're not talking to them, but we're talking to everybody else. And that includes people who are on the conservative side of things, on the more liberal side of things. We're talking to folks who are older. We're talking to folks who are younger, you know, that we're academics and we're making an academic argument, but these are problems that don't just exist within academia, of course. And those of you in the audience, you know, I imagine that most of you, if not all of you, are working on issues that are relevant to everyday people's lives. That these are not just sort of abstract thought experiments. This is about, do we survive as a species? I mean, to be grim about it. And so thinking about the venue for where we put the work, who are we trying to talk to? I think really opening up our own narrative apertures and thinking about how might we hail different audiences? How might we reach them? How can we make materials available? What can we throw out into the world and hope other people use and do cool stuff with? That was, from the very outset, that was our goal. That guided how we wrote the book, and in terms of sort of just our sort of rhetorical frames, but also the tone and the style. We wanted it to be applicable. And an academic book, like we said, that we tried to make it so that any interested party could find something in themselves in the project, but that wasn't even enough. And that was, we wanted to speak to younger people and to the people who would be reading books to those younger people, that this is going to require action and investment from everybody. And stories just so happen to be an extremely powerful way of persuading people and helping them see the world in a different way. And so that was, from day one, that was the idea of the project. And also, if anyone knows anyone who is like a movie producer or something, we would very happily work to try to transform this book into like an animated feature. It would be amazing. Just as an FYI.
We'll all go back into our contact books.
Yeah, that's right.
Just while we're on the question of sort of academic craft, there's another question from Gene and F, which I think is quite fitting in this context, which is basically about the act of collaborating and working together. So what advice do you have for others to find, for one, great collaborators, and then to work together on now? I mean, this is your second book that you've written together, which is quite a remarkable feat.
Yeah, we've been writing together since 2016, 2017.
2014.
Well, what? Okay, yeah. No, because you're right. Ambivalent Internet came out in 2017, and that took us a few years.
2014, friend.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. So, do you have any advice?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, it took us some time to figure out. So, you know, different communication styles means that exactly what worked for us is sort of specific to how we kind of do things in the world. But one of the things that I am most proud of that now is like our go-to, it took maybe 4 years for us to figure this out, but we have a rating system. So the way we assign projects, so within a particular book, one person will take on as project lead for chapters 2, 3, and 4, or whatever the case might be. And they kind of bulk out the thing, and then the other person comes in and adds their thing, and then the other person comes in and adds their thing. And we don't actually write it until the very end to make sure that everybody, that both parties' voice and their kind of argumentative, I don't know, sprinkle magic, that's not a term, but just to make sure that everyone is well represented. But then once we get to the actual writing part, so it's always super equitable from the very beginning, we have a special strategy, and it is a 1 through 10 numeric rating system. So if there's an addition that Ryan wants to make or a language change that he's in favor of, we poll each other and we say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to this? And depending on where we fall, usually we would find ourselves in pretty good agreement. But there would be times where I would be a 2 on something and he would be a 7. And so we would have to then work from this place of negotiating, but it wasn't ego invested.
Yeah.
Using the 1 through 10 system meant I'm just declaring where I am. You're declaring where you are. Nobody's saying who's better or who's worse. There's something quantified about it. And it meant that nobody got mad if I was like, I don't want this word. I'm a 10 on taking away this word. And so then we would sort of determine basically like what the equitability was up till that point. And so there would be times when we would have to say, okay, well, who got the last one? Who sort of won the last time? Although it was never framed adversarially. It was just like, okay, we negotiated our compromise was that you got to include like what thing did you always want to include, like certain kinds of jokes or certain linguistic turns of phrase. Ryan really likes to attribute like feelings to inanimate objects, and that is not my favorite thing. But if we take away something I wanted, then I give him one of those. And so it just keeps it super equal throughout, and we're always paying attention to where the other person is and what they want without ever getting into a fight about it. Like we never fought about anything.
Yeah. I think that just generally what that system and other systems represent is that I feel like we found a good sense of generosity. I think that there's a sense of goodwill. There's not a lot of ego. There's humility, right? Between us. I mean, it takes a lot to like, here are my words. Now here is somebody else who is not me, who's going to go into those words at draft stage and say, well, this is shit. Okay, cut this. Oh, what about this? Oh, you forgot about this. And if either person comes to that dynamic with bad faith, with selfishness, seeing the other person as an adversary, then I think that's when the dynamic can start to crumble. And so one thing that has been great working with Whit for all these years is that there's never been any hint of that, right? It's always been a real team effort, and we have been able to intertwine our voices because we see the output as worth it, and we don't put as much individual ego into the process.
No, we're never trying. Nobody is trying to win. I mean, we what we do, I mean, when I did the scare quotes and sort of laughed saying like, sometimes the other person will concede. That's never coming. It's usually sort of, we go in the opposite direction as you might think. So instead of kind of fighting about who gets to win that, we have to negotiate the other person saying, well, I want you to have it because I want you to be happy. I want you to have this joke that you like. I want you to be able to attribute, sort of an anthropomorphized possessive to this notebook, Ryan. I know you like that. And so we sometimes would have to talk ourselves out of being really conciliatory, but there never was, I have to fight, my voice is supreme, you have to do what I say. It was, I trust you. I trust you that you're coming at this in good faith and that I take you seriously. And so let's find a way to really find a nice compromise that honors both parties. And so it in the end has been, I don't know, really affirming. I'm absolutely a better scholar. I'm absolutely a better writer. I'm a better person from working through this because it really requires trust and it requires kindness and it requires patience and all of those things. And so it's been great. And there will be another book someday, you know, I mean, once we
Hopefully.
figure out what that's going to be.
Hopefully. I mean, thank you so much for sharing these really personal insights. I think probably one last question to wrap things up before we run out of time. And that sort of basically ties it back to the states we currently all find ourselves in, which is the pandemic. Have your reflections and techniques changed or evolved since the pandemic? Asked one of the viewers, and particularly since many more people are trusting and relying on information in many ways, that sort of helps them to form their opinions and also their behavior towards COVID and the COVID response.
I made that face because we got so tired integrating COVID into the book as we were writing it was something that we had to do at the tail end, and I am still tired from it. So Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about that process and how that worked?
So I think that one thing that the COVID crisis has shown us is that the one of the core tenets of the book that I don't think we thought of as a core tenet going in, but kind of emerged throughout the book, has been all the more true. And that core tenet is the emphasis on the communitarian ethic, the emphasis on we over me. And if we're going to get through this this problem of polluted information and get through this network crisis, we have to do it together. We have to do it by thinking communally, not just me and my rights to do what I want, but we and our rights to have vibrant, healthy information ecosystems. And so this tension between me and my rights and that kind of very rah-rah American individual liberty versus a more collective communal we emphasis, it's a big part of platform moderation debates, freedom of expression versus protecting the community. And then it became a really big part of, in the US, our national debates, and eye rolls very obvious here, over whether or not you should wear a mask, right? And so a lot of the philosophical tenets that ended up driving You Are Here have become all the more important, we think, as we deal with the crisis on a scale that we didn't really imagine we'd be talking about or thinking about in the early stages of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's also just the logistic point of, as COVID conspiracy theorizing clashed with conspiracy theorizing around, you know, QAnon and the deep state, we had to include that as it was happening. And so it ended up just being kind of a natural extension of a lot of what we had written about with these other far-right conspiracy theories, because they were drawing from the same kind of deep mimetic frame pool, so to speak. And so we didn't realize, I mean, when we went into lockdown, when we first started doing those edits, I had been exposed and so was in quarantine. And for all those 14 days was like, okay, we have to now integrate COVID into this discussion. So COVID is now a character in the book where it never had been. But also, it really helped kind of highlight what the ethic of the book is, what the philosophy of the book was, and what we believe in and what we want to do now moving forward in the world.
Excellent, thank you. What a great discussion. I mean, I for one have certainly learned a lot. To our viewers, thank you all for attending and the many questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to answer all of them. It's just always too many questions for too little time. And finally, once again, thank you so much, Whitney and Ryan, for your great talk, the great discussions, and for finding the time to join us tonight. And good luck with the children's book. I certainly look forward to seeing that as well. And stay safe, and good night to everyone else.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank y'all.
Thank you to Whitney, Ryan and Felix for a fascinating insight today, and thank you all for attending. You'll receive a follow-up email in due course. Our next OII webinar is on Wednesday, the 24th of February at 5 p.m. UK time. And it's the second installment of the Next Gen series hosted by Professor Gina Neff. Dr. Matthew Bui will discuss what is urban data justice, defining, conceptualizing and exploring data use, reuse and refusal for racial justice. Please visit the events page on the OII website to register. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.